I'm Director of Organizing and Advocacy at New Yorkers for Clean Power, and this is the second of two teach-ins we've done on the New Efficiency New York proceeding. And we have with us two terrific presenters, Juan Pablo Velez of Wind Climate and Rebecca Morris Gonzalez of the Pratt Institute, who have a lot of important information to share with you. So let's get the slideshow going and get started without any further ado. If you want to introduce yourselves in the chat as we go, please say your name, pronouns, affiliation, and maybe let us know how you heard about this webinar. Okay, so what is New Efficiency New York, otherwise known as NENY? This is a plan that was made in New York at the Public Service Commission to accelerate the growth of building energy efficiency and electrification in New York over a period of 10 years. The goal by 2025 was to have achieved 185,000 trillion BTUs, that's British thermal units, in energy savings. That's the equivalent of 1.8 million homes energy saved. A British thermal unit is the stupidest measure of energy ever. It's basically the heat generated by striking one match. So it's very hard to imagine what 185 trillion of those is, but that's the unit that we use. And there's also a goal of increasing workforce development in building energy efficiency and improving access to measures by low and moderate income households. So this program was, so what happens at the Public Service Commission, instead of making a law, they have something called a proceeding. And the proceeding is like a process of creating something, and then that ends with an order. And the order is basically equivalent to a law. So they made this, there was an order in, I believe, late 2018, and the programs generating from that order launched in 2020. So now we're, coming up at the end of 4 years of these programs. What the programs do is spend approximately $1 billion a year of ratepayer money. Ratepayer money is a pot of money that is collected not through your taxes, but through your utility bills. So every month you pay a utility bill for your gas and or electric, and there's this charge on there called the system benefit charge, and that funds a lot of these programs. So this is money collected from almost every New York household, and this order said we're going to spend a lot of that money on building energy efficiency and electrification. And so the way that we're spending that money is through several programs. One is called the Clean Heat Program, and that's basically rebates for heat pumps, including geothermal heat pumps, air source heat pumps, and heat pump water heaters. And that program is administered by the utilities. So if you want a rebate and you live in NYCP territory, you get your rebate from NYCP. And if you live in Con Ed territory, you get your rebate from Con Ed. And each utility has a slightly different system of rebates, and the amounts differ and the programs differ. There's also a program called Empower Plus. It used to be two programs that got merged into one, and it's now called Empower Plus, which you're going to hear about from one of our speakers, or actually both of them. And these are grants given out to low and moderate income households for weatherization, and sometimes also for heat pumps as well. And these are administered by the State Energy Agency, NYSERDA. And there's also money allocated for workforce development. So this is a really great idea. It's very forward-looking. It actually came out before we had the climate action plan. This precedes that. And it really was a very forward-looking idea for New York, very progressive, very good plan that's for improving people's lives, people's health, people's safety, energy efficiency, and of course, for climate. So all of that is very, very good. So but you're going to hear from our presenters that our good goals for this plan have not been met the way they should, and we have an opportunity to improve greatly how the money is spent. Next slide, please. So where are we? So the New Efficiency New York programs were launched in 2020. And last summer, after sort of evaluating how the programs were doing, a new strategic framework was announced. Early this year, which I will say the new strategic framework did include some pretty good improvements. We just think they need to be better. Early this year, there were technical conferences where there was a lot of discussions about the strategic framework and how to improve it. And then a lot of organizations working together started to have meetings and think about what input we needed to give to the Public Service Commission about how to spend the money going forward. We put together, one of the things we did is put together a letter that many of you in your organization signed. And this picture on the right is us delivering that to the Public Service Commission in May of this year. The tall gentleman in the middle of the picture is PSC Chairman Rory Christian. And two of the commissioners are to the right. This is Uchenna Bright and Denise Sheehan, right between, and I'm standing in between them. So we gave them this letter signed by, I think, 150 or more organizations saying there's some really important principles that we think you're still missing. And we're going to talk about those today a little bit more. So in yellow, whoops, back to the slide, sorry. In yellow, you can see opportunities to give input. You are here, and that's why we're all meeting today, to talk about and understand this a lot better and to give very needed input to the commission to improve what's going to be the next order. So a new draft order is coming out this year, maybe in October, maybe later, we don't know. And so we have an opportunity now to influence what's going to be in that new draft order. After the new draft order comes out, we anticipate there's going to be more opportunities to give input, and the final order will come out sometime next year because they're going to be launching the new programs January 1st of 2026. Next slide. So in the letter that many of you signed, we outlined 3 key sort of high-level objectives. They are to invest more money, a lot more money for low and moderate income households, 50% of the total budget. We also need to make the programs easier to use and make them make sense, make them meet people where they're at, and also to value our lives, health, comfort, and safety. So really thinking about not just energy savings, but the health and other benefits that households can have from getting these measures. For example, cleaner air, or like the access to air conditioning, which many households don't have. So I think I'm over my time. I'm getting texts from Melissa. I think that's what she's trying to tell me. And I'm ready to turn it over to our very first speaker, who is Rebecca Morris-Gonzalez of the Pratt Institute. She's going to share the key findings from her report. And Rebecca, I'll let you introduce yourself.
Great. Thank you so much, Lisa. Hi, everybody. Good afternoon. My name is Rebecca Morris-Gonzalez. I am the Director of Climate Initiatives at the Pratt Center for Community Development. And today I'm going to be talking about one very specific issue with NYCERDA's Empower Plus program that has a very large negative impact on how effective the program is. Next slide, please. So Pratt Center is located in Brooklyn. We are a part of Pratt Institute, and we have been around for 60 years. We are the first university-based community planning organization in the country, and we work with low and moderate income communities and communities of color in New York City for a more just, equitable, and sustainable city for all. Next slide. To give a little background, Pratt Center has been engaged in trying to increase retrofits, clean energy access, the like, since at least 2009. Prior to that, I believe there was stuff, but it's way before my time, and I actually joined in 2012, so some of this is before. But as you can see, we have really been engaged for a very long time, working with the 1 to 4 family building stock in New York City, trying to figure out how to help them access the benefits of energy efficiency. Next slide, please. So what are we here to talk about? Empower Plus has so Empower Plus, to give a little background, is the big program that is meant to support all the low and moderate income households in 1 to 4 family buildings across the state in implementing efficiency, electrification, and sort of all of the decisions that are going to be made through NENY will have a big impact on Empower Plus, which thus has an impact on whether New Yorkers are actually receiving the incentives that they should be receiving. As you can see, in New York City, we have very low numbers. And so there's 863,000 1 to 4 family buildings in New York City. They account for about 17% of buildings emissions. And the data since 2010 shows us that only 3% of eligible buildings have been retrofit. And when you look at this chart, you can see that there are the breakout with assisted and Empower. Assisted was the old version of the moderate income program. But when you combine the two, we estimate about 2/3 of the 863,000 buildings in New York City are located in low income and moderate income census tracts and should be eligible for this program, potentially. Next slide, please. Except what we see is that actually, in fact, 93% of projects since 2010, so this is 14 years now, this data is through 2023, 93% have occurred outside of the 5 boroughs of New York City, despite the fact that we have so many buildings and a large amount of the population, and particularly a large amount of low-income population and Black and brown population. Next slide. So the question is, why is uptake so low in New York City despite having all of these homes? And we have the CLCPA where we're supposed to be helping disadvantaged communities, and yet we're seeing the low-income Black and brown households in New York City that really need support not getting it. Next slide. So it all comes down to the way that they determine income eligibility. And so to give a little background, right? So Empower Plus does have other rules, but and other barriers, but this really is the number one, in my view, this is the number one barrier to increasing the number of retrofits that are occurring in New York State. The reason is because NYCP decides to use something called state median income to determine the eligibility of participants in this program. And so what state median income is right, the median is sort of the middle of all the entire range of incomes. And then they use that same indicator across the entire state. So it doesn't matter where you live, it doesn't matter what the cost of living is, everybody's considered at the same level for being quote unquote low income, although we all know that it's still not low enough, right? I mean, not high enough. And then area median income is what we would like to see them using and what should be being used, because area median income is based around where a person in New York State, and actually countrywide, this is a HUD tool, live and what the cost of living is there and housing. And so NYCP chooses to use state median income for their low income program, but it should be noted that not for their moderate income program. And so this is a big problem. Next slide, please. So first of all, just to give a little context, all of these programs at New York State HCR, everything within New York City's HPD housing programs, even NYCP's Empower Plus moderate income services, and the affordable multifamily program, they all use AMI to determine who is eligible. Empower Plus low income households are the only ones from all of these programs that are using state median income, excuse me. Next slide, please. So what does that look like, right? Well, what is that differential? And I apologize if this is a little small, but so I wanted to show a little bit about the gap statewide versus the New York City metropolitan area. What you can see here, right, is on this chart on the top, everything in the light blue is what 60% SMI is. And then if you were to just change it to 60% AMI, that's the black line below. And then that white is the gap, right? And so, for example, a family of 2 in New York City is considered to be would have another $20,000 available under their income to be considered eligible if they were using AMI, but they're not. And to be very clear, if you are even $1 over the income limit for these programs, you all of a sudden are pushed out of this and offered 50% of what should be 100% covered costs. And you only have $1 more in income a month than somebody else who's eligible. And so this is a visual of what that actually looks like in terms of New York City, right? So we did some mapping here of the building stock of 1 to 4s across census tracts in New York City. And so with a limited increase, which is what we at the very least would like to see, is an increase of 60% AMI. And you can already see right in this map, like how many more houses start popping up that could potentially be eligible to reduce their carbon emissions. Next slide. And I should have mentioned this before, many of you have probably heard about the Inflation Reduction Act, which is about to send New York State, or has sent about $300 million plus to be using to help electrify. And in that program, they are pulling that money into Empower Plus, and they are allowed to increase up to 80%, say a low-income household is up to 80% AMI. But NYCP is not choosing to do that. They're continuing to use 60% SMI for their state incentives. Next slide. Next slide. And so, I know I'm talking about New York City, and that's because that's sort of the focus of our work, but we feel like it's very important to advocate for low-income communities everywhere in New York State, for Black and Brown communities everywhere in New York State. And so we also analyzed what was happening outside of New York City in terms of comparing state median income to local, to area median income. And what we found on this map is what you'll see is that anyone that is that light blue that says 1 member household. So basically you determine median income by the eligibility by the number of people in your house and how much you earn. And so all of these counties, there's 34 of them, have at least one household size within that band that is ineligible because AMI is higher than SMI. And so then all the white parts are where SMI is higher than AMI. And so for that reason, we believe that NYCP should change the rules to say you are eligible based off either SMI or AMI, whichever one is higher, which is the rule that they use for their moderate income program. Next slide, please. So why should this matter to you? Climate change, climate change, climate change. I think we all know that, right? Our low-income neighbors cannot afford to retrofit and electrify their homes. Funding is vital, and without funding, projects do not get completed and emissions remain unabated. The federal government's IRA funding, again, I already said this, right? They already have an allowance for us to increase it. Racial justice, I mean, really looking at those numbers, to me, it looks really bad that only 7% of all retrofits have occurred in a predominantly Black and Brown city in New York. And lastly, program design is the deliberate human decision. It can be changed. Next slide, please. And so what can you do with this information? Now, first of all, I recommend you go and look at your community's current low-income cutoff amounts. You might be interested to see sort of what state median income is versus area. And I can put a link in the chat later where you can actually look up your county. And so we have been advocating, we submitted letters to the PSC about changing AMI because the PSC can mandate to NYCP that they need to utilize AMI rather than SMI for decision-making. And so I'd also like to encourage you to attend, there's an August 1st stakeholder webinar, which you'll hear about more at the end. And lastly, this number right here is directly to the Public Service Commission, where you can leave a comment. And I know that was very quick, but thank you very much. And we'll have questions at the end.
That was wonderful. Thank you so much, Rebecca. And now, Melissa, I think you can stop sharing and we'll let Juan Pablo share next. Please, we're going to do questions after Juan Pablo. So please jot down your questions, type them in the chat, and we'll try to pull them out. And what we do at our teach-ins is any questions we don't get to during the 1 hour teach-in, we email to the presenters and share their answers afterwards in our follow-up email. So if you have a question and we don't get to it today, that's the plan. So good to go. So I'm very pleased to introduce Juan Pablo Velez, the founder and executive director of the think tank Win Climate. JP's report that he's about to present on, we brought and hand delivered to the Public Service Commission along with the letter signed by these organizations, and they were very pleased to have it. So without any further ado, let's dig in to the data.
Great, thanks so much for that introduction. So I am the founder and ED of a think tank that is basically a bunch of data scientists that works to provide insights for climate advocates so we can win more ambitious state policy. And I'm going to go through, we're going to zoom out of a single program of Empower and look at how all this money has been spent. So that'll be the focus. If you just can't get enough, this is all written up in a report that we'll send out afterwards. Fun fact is that this wood block was made by a friend of mine who used to be a bureaucrat at NYCP, and she takes commissions in case anybody wants more weatherization art in their house. All right, this report was commissioned by Agree, which is a group a lot of you know. And the big idea is that the regulators, the utility regulators, the PSC, have spent over 2.4 billion of your energy bill dollars over the last, basically since the pandemic started. And you might wonder what all that money added up to, given all the work we have to do to make energy cheaper and to deal with climate change. They're set to double the amount of spending in the sort of second phase of NENY, which starts in 2026. And so, same questions: will they hit the goals? So, this talk will have we'll be looking back at what has happened and looking forward at what is being proposed in this reform. Okay, so I keep talking about these goals. What are our goals? One is all this money actually being spent to effectively decarbonize our buildings? And a way of talking about that in energy efficiency jargon is, what measures was the money spent on? Measures are just like, are you insulating the house? Are you giving somebody a new boiler? Each of those interventions is called a measure. Equity is who actually got all these benefits. And CLCP alignment is how, of all the work we have to do, how big a chunk did we do? It's basically the scale question. Are we doing this at scale? And going forward, same exact questions, but applied not to what the utilities and NYCP did historically, but what they're proposing to do going forward. So we got to talk about measures before any of the rest will make sense. There's a lot of ways to reduce the energy consumption of a building. Some of them reduce electricity use, some of them reduce gas use, basically. And they've been bucketed into 3 buckets as part of this reform that I'm going to walk you through now. So there are measures called strategic measures, and these are ones that basically are seen to align with decarbonization. Important to note is that energy efficiency and decarbonization are not the same thing. You can try to have the most efficient boiler ever that uses 100%, almost 100% efficient, and it still is producing fossil fuels. So it's important. Part of why we'll see that a lot of the money was not spent for decarbonization is it was not originally designed to. It's a program about energy efficiency. The goal was to reduce energy use, not to maximize emissions cuts, even though this whole multi-billion-dollar initiative was started after our Climate Act was passed. I won't comment on whether it was the right goal, but it's important context. Okay, so these strategic measures are things like heat pumps, weatherization, and some kinds of electrical efficiency for businesses. So more electrically efficient machines. But basically, it's mostly about getting the fossil fuels out of our buildings and stop wasting all this heat so that heat pumps work better. neutral measures, there's very few of them from what I can tell, so I'm going to skip them. And then there's these bucket called unstrategic, which is a lot of other things you might be familiar with. So efficient light bulbs, giving people more efficient boilers and furnaces, other gas efficiency measures like insulating people's pipes, giving people home reports that are like, hey, did you know that you spend way more electricity than your neighbor? Maybe do something about that. We spent millions of dollars on that across the state. And then most efficient electrical appliances, like giving people more efficient fridges and stuff, that is no longer being subsidized either. So a lot less focus on kind of doubling down on more efficient use of fossil fuels, and also less focus on electrical efficiency for the most part, which is a big shift because those have been the mainstays of energy efficiency since the 70s. Okay, so these are our measures and how strategic they are. So let's talk about whether they met the goals. I'm about to show you a bunch of charts, but for now, I'll just give you the big picture takeaways. So decarbonization, did we meet the goal? Well, only kind of. Half of the money that we spent, or half of that 2.4 billion went to strategic stuff, the other half did not. Going forward, a lot of the unstrategic is being eliminated, which is good news. They don't go quite far enough, but it's definitely progress. On equity, roughly 40% of New Yorkers are low or moderate income, using the area median income definition that was just discussed. But if you look at where, some of the money went to businesses, some of the money went to residences. If you look at the money that went to residences, only $1 in $4 went to low and moderate income New Yorkers, even though they make up 40% of the population. So if we were just spending the money proportionately, it's 13 points off. And there's an argument to be made that we should spend it disproportionately on the folks who can't afford as much and will stand to benefit more. So that's how far off they were. Going forward, it's better, but not perfect. So it is now 36% of the residential spending, but that's not even proportional yet. And again, most advocates want it to be closer to 50%. In terms of CLCPA alignment, that 2.4 billion that we have spent in those 3 years, that was only 10% of what we needed probably to spend in those 3 years, which means we have an $18 billion gap already, and that's set to just get bigger. So even though the annual budget for NENY is probably going to grow to 1.5 billion, which is the most we've ever spent as a state, the amount we need grows even faster, so that we end up with a $50 billion gap in investment by 2030. There's some good news at the end, so do not panic, but that is the current situation. Okay, that was a lot of word vomit, so I will pause so people can absorb these findings. And then I will move on. So we're going to look at decarbonization, how the money has been spent to date. And I'm going to walk through this step by step. So each of the bars here is how much money, the height of the bars is how much money was spent on energy efficiency before and after NENY. NENY starts in 2020. We were already doing all this stuff before NENY, but we were doing it at a much smaller scale. The year Trump was elected, we only spent 155 million on energy efficiency statewide. And it's projected to grow up to 1.5 billion a year, so 10 times more than what we were doing just 10 years before. And walking through the colors now. So the first thing you can see is the amount we spend has been growing steadily year by year and has really increased during NENY. Now the colors are basically what measures were spent on. And it took us basically 2 months of work to create just this one chart because the utilities and NYSERDA are not required to tell us exactly what they're spending the money on. We had to really do a lot of investigation to figure this out. But the darkest blue at the bottom is how much we spent on heat pumps year by year. But you can see we were almost not at all subsidizing heat pumps until some of the folks on this very call pushed the PSC to include it as part of NENY. And you can see that heat pumps really exploded in 2022. That is basically almost entirely because Con Ed made the benefit more generous, and there was a run on the farm running the bank, so to speak, and then they ran out of money, and it was a big scandal, and a fair amount of HVAC contractors went belly up, and so they really pulled back the next year. Cautionary tale for how to run these programs well, but that's why you see this explosion in the dark blue is just Con Ed. Next, then this kind of grayish blue right above that, that's building shells. So this is like air sealing and insulating the walls in the attic and just keeping the heat in. And what jumps out here is we've done very little of it. In 2019, we only spent $50 million in the world's 11th largest economy, keeping the heat in, even though our building stock is super old and leaky. It's gone better, but we only are really... in 2023, we spent 162 million, which is not even as much as we spent on all the unstrategic stuff that we should probably be doing less of. So unstrategic is in brown, and that's like lighting and giving people new gas boilers and stuff like that. And some also more efficient appliances. So it's 2023, the hour is late, and we still spent probably $50 million on light bulbs in 2023. Not the best use of ratepayer funds, in my opinion, but they're finally getting rid of that. That's the picture to date. Is the good stuff is coming in, it's getting stronger, but we have a lot of this legacy in between. And then there's this sort of other strategic in blue, which is mostly electrical efficiency. So it's like things that are still considered strategic, basically getting businesses more efficient electrical machines. Yeah, let's keep going. So that is the past. And this is the future. So all the numbers you were just seeing are here on the side. 2024 for 2025, we don't have plans for that right now, but this is what's being proposed. So first thing you will see is it starts at 1 billion and climbs to 1.5. And you will also notice that there is no brown, pretty much. They have successfully decided that we shouldn't spend your energy bill dollars on giving people efficient light bulbs, since those are pretty much standard now, and that we probably also shouldn't be subsidizing most folks getting new gas boilers at this point, although there's a good argument to be made that we should keep doing that for multifamily low-income buildings. But as a kind of overall practice, it's been removed in the proposals. And what we see is that heat pump spending continues to go up. Weatherization spending, which is like this grayish blue here, is bigger than ever. So it's going to start at 224 million, which is more than we've ever spent on it. And then we'll peak at 325 million. There's a whole bunch still in other strategic. A lot of this is just like going to businesses. And then there is this bizarre like grayish blue at the top. And that is what we know it's supposed to be strategic spending, but we don't know what it is exactly because they're still not being super transparent. Even though we're talking about hundreds of millions of dollars, we do not know what it's supposed to go to at the moment. So it might be that a lot of that becomes weatherization, and that would be good. But at the moment, in the opinion of lots of advocates, this is not good enough. There should be a lot more going to weatherization in particular. And so basically, we should probably squeeze out some of this unknown and electrical efficiency with more weatherization. But it's certainly better than what we were doing before. Okay, so that is, are we spending the money? Have we spent the money to do climate stuff? And are we going to be spending money to do climate stuff? Now let's talk about equity. So go back to the last, the spending since 2016 until last year, and we will now look at the same money from an equity lens. So this is now who received the money. Starting from the bottom, bright green is residential, like 1 to 4 unit residential for low and moderate income. In other words, that's the Empower program that Becca was just talking about. Then there's multifamily low moderate income. As you can see, it's almost nothing, even though a lot of New York City is multifamily low and moderate income. We've spent almost nothing on it so far. The next one is residential market rates. In other words, single family homes that are market rate. A lot of money has gone there, and that's because pretty much all of the heat pump subsidy has gone to market rate single family. So that's why you have this green explosion. It's pretty much a lot of that is the heat pump explosion. Next up above that is market rate multifamily. Also not spending a lot of money on that. That's a theme. So not whether it's low LMI or market rate, we are not super focused on market rate yet. And then a healthy amount on commercial. It's a little bit easier to view this in percentage terms. And what we see is that the share of LMI has been pretty constant, even though the spending has grown. So the absolute amount of money going to lower moderate income has gone up, but not really as a share. And most importantly, what I was saying earlier, if you look at like all this money piled up here and you ask what percentage of all this money went to LMI, it's only 27% of the residential. So, and for total spending is actually 18%. That's a visualization of the thing I said earlier. Now, going forward, viewed from an equity lens, what do we see? We see that a big focus on multifamily low moderate income, that's the pink, and pretty good on market rate multifamily. So that's getting fixed, the neglect of multifamily. What is curious is that the amount going to single family low moderate income, the Empower program, is pretty much flat, which is bizarre. So that means it's shrinking as a share of the pie. We think it's because of this Inflation Reduction Act money that was mentioned earlier. But even when you add that in, it's not a ton of money because it's 300 million spread out over 5 years. And I'll let you do the math on that. And we still have a big share going to commercial. This is viewed in percentage terms. You can, if you pay attention, if you kind of squint and look at the red stuff at the bottom, you can see that it's a bigger share every year, but not like hugely more. This is why it's basically a third of the residential spending. Residential spending is everything that is not blue. It's about a third of that. And a quarter of all spending. So it's like the equity picture is not changing drastically. What's changing is that they're putting a greater share towards multifamily. And then this brings up a larger discussion, which is these are grants, right? So you're just like giving people, you're picking up the tab for when they insulate their home or put a heat pump in their business or get a more efficient pool pump or whatever. And the question is what are these grants for and who should get them? Because we also have loans, and maybe the government, part of what the government should be doing is making lower interest loans for people who can afford the loans and targeting the grants towards people who don't have the credit, perhaps, or the cash flow to get the loans. But we don't really do that at scale today. So what advocates want is for half of the money to be reddish. In other words, half of the money to go to LMI, residential, both single and multifamily, and for the share of market rate residential and commercial to be smaller, because maybe we could use some of that money instead to get private capital in the mix. So maybe it can be used in a catalytic fashion, and that leaves more money for the folks who cannot access financing as much. Finally, we are going to talk about all the spending we've been doing. Is it enough? That's the CLCPA alignment. That's just jargon for saying, we spent a bunch of money, how much of it should we have spent to keep in line with decarbonizing all our buildings by 2050? So this is the money spent to date at NENY. We're going to just focus on the period after 2020. And then we're going to zoom out, and this gray bar is how much money we probably should have spent in public dollars at the time. So this comes from a simulation that NYCP did that said, hey, if we need to replace all the boilers and furnaces and insulate enough buildings to decarbonize everything by 2050, how much money do we need to spend overall? just like how much would that cost to do? And then we took 20% of that and said, okay, let's assume that the state picks up, or even the feds, like the government picks up 20% of all that investment that has to happen. That gray $5 billion a year, that's 20%. So what this goes to show is we in the first year in 2020, we need to spend about $5.5 billion, and we only spent about 500 million, so we were 5 billion short. So even though spending has grown pretty dramatically, it's still not even close to the amount we need every year. And that means that if you add up all the gray, we have an $18 billion gap so far. We're already $18 billion behind where we should be, because we've only been spending about 10% of the public dollars we need to spend to do this. And if we add in that big spending increase, the gap only grows because the amount we need also grows. So today we need 5.5 billion in total. That will grow by to 7.5 billion by 2030. So we need $2 billion extra, and we're only increasing by 5 billion from 1 to 1.5 billion. So the gap like not only persists, but it actually widens. This is important, it's sobering, but it gives us a sense of scale, which is that like what we're doing is not up to scale. We need to be doing probably 4 to 5 times more of these projects. And that means at least 4 to 5 times more public funding, probably more, because to catalyze more of these projects, we need each of the incentives to be more generous, so more people actually go for them. Okay, but there's a limit to how much we can increase everybody's energy bills, especially since that's a regressive way of raising what are essentially taxes. People say rates, but they're really just taxes in a way. And so there's a lot of discussion about how else we could fund this. And the good news is we might have this cap and trade system coming to New York State that would put a price on dirty energy and raise a bunch of money. And it would raise anywhere between $3 billion to $9 billion a year, which is a lot like what we need here. So if a healthy chunk of that revenue gets used, we can actually do this. It's not impossible. And that's before maybe eventually the feds will pick up more of the tab. And maybe we can be clever with low interest financing to make up some of the tab as well. And there's a bunch of other ideas, but this is kind of like back of the envelope stuff to show you that, yes, we're not spending nearly enough, but it's not impossible either. There's a lot of money that we could throw at this problem. And that's all I got.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Juan Pablo. And for those of you who found that last slide extremely daunting, please sign up for our teach-in on Cap and Invest happening next week, and we're going to share the sign up for that. So now we're going to open it up to some questions and answers, and we're going to pull those out of the chat. I think that's the easiest way. So please go ahead. If you haven't already typed your questions into the chat, please go ahead and type them. Betta, do you have a question ready for me, or should I be looking for them myself?
Oh, hey, Lisa. I copied all of the questions into the Google Doc. But we can certainly, there were so many great questions, and many people tried to answer questions live as we were going. One question from Kate was how much money is being left on the table, as in are there funds each year that NYCP is just not using for this program?
Yeah, JP, do you want to take that one?
Sure. Well, the big problem that people talk about, and this was mentioned in the chat, is a lot of, especially single family, low moderate income homes have mold or asbestos or are not in a state of good repair, and they need to be fixed before they can be weatherized. And so you do get the situation if you talk to weatherization contractors, where contractors will cherry pick the homes that are easiest, in part because there's just not enough money to deal with the ones that need that, like the funding doesn't stretch towards those sort of health and safety issues. And so, yeah, some of the money is being left on the table, simply because we can't use ratepayer dollars apparently to fix some houses.
And I'd just like to add to that there is something that NYCP doesn't want to actually spend down the entire pot, which I know some of the advocates that I've been talking about, like, how silly is that? We need to get as many retrofits done as possible. We are literally fighting a ticking time bomb, right? And I had also recently heard that there was money even allotted in the state budget last year, and that hasn't been spent either. So that question is actually very good. We don't know exactly how much I don't know how much is left on the table right now, but we know that they're not down spending all the Empower Plus money.
Thank you. There's a lot of back and forth about SMI and AMI, and why do we feel like the state is making this decision not to go with the higher number, and is it because it's linked to other programs like SNAP? Rebecca, do you want to double?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. So
Uh,
so SNAP and other federally funded programs, right? Their rule is to use state median income. I believe that's what happens across the entire country. And so there had been a question about, can we advocate to change that? Well, not through the suggestions and what I'm talking about here. So, however, NYCP maybe gets like a very, very tiny percent of their funding for Empower Plus from that pot of money. And in fact, the new rules, apparently they're saying if you go through OTDI, you aren't eligible for the IRA funds anyways. But the question of like, why the rest of the money, so say it's like
Rebecca, can you try to not use acronyms, because not everybody's familiar? So
sorry. I don't even know what acronym I use at this point. Sorry.
Office of Temporary
Disability Assistance. Yes,
Assistance.
apologies. So
alphabet soup.
So essentially, I'm making the numbers up, but it's essentially something like 95% of funding doesn't have this requirement, and then like this small tiny amount does. So rather than sort of determining an avenue to ensure that that funding gets spent under the rules of the federal government, and the rest actually is uplifting the communities that are currently being left behind, they just continue to choose this. And I've asked so many times in public forums, like, why? And every time it's a different answer. It's too hard. The PSC won't let us. It's just what we've always done, right? Like, there isn't a real answer. And I think part of it is, personally, I feel like there is some classism and some racism and some just general, just complete lack of understanding of like the realities of income inequality, and how we can try and fix that. So thank you. I'll stop there.
That's great. There's so much we could talk about on each of these things. There's some questions about these barriers to putting these measures into buildings, problems with buildings like mold, lead, asbestos, leaky roofs, inadequate wiring. We do have a bill that we're trying to pass to create a funding stream to address those barriers to energy efficiency and electrification. But I wonder if, Rebecca, you or Juan Pablo would like to sort of just talk a little bit more about, some people are saying, is it worth investing in these buildings? How do we decide? At what point do we tear down these old buildings and build newer ones? Like, so maybe a little discussion about that, because it is a big subject and people might not know, but New York's building stock is actually the oldest of any state in the country. And Buffalo is the American city with the oldest building stock on average. So we do have a problem with old and fairly decrepit buildings generally. So go ahead, Rebecca.
Sure, yeah. So I'm currently running a decarbonization demonstration project here in Brooklyn with low-income homeowners in a few neighborhoods, and we are doing this because we want to track the real costs because the incentives are so low anyways, and NYSERDA doesn't understand what it actually costs to do business in New York City. And so we're trying to collect real-time data to like give to them and hopefully get them to change sort of what they reimburse contractors for. And health and safety is definitely a big issue. We definitely see issues in almost all houses, but I will say that a large majority of them, these projects so far, you know, the repairs are around maybe like $3,000 to $5,000, right? It might be some mold remediation or leaky roof. Some of them are most definitely like, you know, we do lead testing for every house, and some houses we have to say we cannot help you because the lead remediation would be way too expensive and it's just everywhere. So I don't know if tearing them down is really the right way to move forward, as these are owned by individuals and it's their homes. But I would say that, you know, I think there is a reason that we can't incentivize 100% for some of these projects, but that there is not too big of a health and safety issue that we can't be actually paying for a large percent of these, of the issues that arise.
Yeah. Juan Pablo, did you want to add anything to that? Did you get a chance to look into that at all? I mean, one of the things that we haven't been able to get good data on is how many buildings are rejected from programs because of these pre-existing problems. And there's no good data. Like if a contractor goes to a building for an energy audit, they will just take a look at the building. If they see big barriers, they won't put in an application because they know it'll be rejected. So they don't want to waste their time because they know they won't be able to sell anything or do a project. So they just walk away. We don't have good data on how often that happens. Were you able to get any?
Yeah, we really don't know
Yeah.
the size of the problem. Probably at some point the state should do like a proper survey of properties and get us some idea. I did a few dozen calls to contractors to figure this out. And what I learned is that these health and safety problems are definitely a bigger issue in single family buildings than multifamily buildings. Particularly in New York City, a lot of the lead problems and asbestos problems have been remediated over time because of local rules. So a lot of what we're talking about is wooden houses upstate that are in very bad shape. And, you know, intuitively, it's like, maybe we should tear them down and start anew, but really it's a lot of the folks who are in them can't afford new construction, and they could maybe afford to fix what they already have if there were supplemental funds. So it makes sense kind of at an everyday level, but in terms of how these decisions get made, it's hard to do.
And if I can just add one quick thing to that, what I will say is that one, I already know, well, I mean, I don't even think the numbers would be accurate at this point about who's denied, because contractors at this point know what the income limits are, and they don't even bother like trying to submit and see if they can get, if somebody tells them generally this is my income, they'll just move on. So there's that. But also, NYSERDA could release the data because they release all of the projects that have gone all the way through. So they must know and have that information somewhere, but they do not share it.
I do want to go to next steps, but if you want to quickly address the question about why is LED lighting not considered a strategic measure in your report, Juan Pablo, there was some back and forth about that and some questions about LED lighting in commercial buildings. If you want to just do the 10-second explanation.
Sure. So our report just follows what the Public Service Commission thinks is not strategic. But I think the idea is that, like, we can, first of all, that's a very mature technology. They don't cost that much more than regular light bulbs. And the federal government, I'm pretty sure, just mandated that they have to be sold anyway. So that's also subsidizing them and then claiming that there were energy savings means that you're saying that somebody wouldn't have gone out to buy a slightly more expensive light bulb anyway. Which is pretty suspicious. So I think a lot of the energy savings that they're claiming around light bulbs are made up. But then there's this bigger picture idea, which is ultimately we can make electricity cheaper without households doing anything. But we can't efficiency our way to zero fossil fuel combustion in homes. At some point, we have to electrify the heating system. And so probably that's where we should be spending our money. because one, heat pumps are more expensive than boilers. That's pretty well known. But two, what's not as well known is, unfortunately, at the moment, they all tend to be more expensive to operate than natural gas, unless you've weatherized. And so weatherization is great because it can lower your bills now, even if you're still on gas, but it will also help to make electric heat affordable. And you can't say that about insulating gas pipes or something like that. So I think there's just it's more of a qualitative, like, it's great to save energy. The question is, there's this big hurdle, there's this big challenge of needing to just stop with the fossil fuel combustion in buildings. And so that's why there's less of a focus on more electrical efficiency, because we can clean the electricity at the grid level.
Okay. We'll have to end there because, Melissa, if you could please share the slides and we'll just go through quickly. We have some next steps. So let's pass this one. This is our 3 key objectives that I talked about earlier. So we have some things coming up. So if this information shared by Juan Pablo and Rebecca disturbed or upset you and you want to do something about it, we have some ways for you to take action coming up. And the first one is, there is a stakeholder meeting being hosted by NYCP for the low to moderate income programs. It's a 2-hour WebEx on the 1st of August. These are not interactive. You won't be able to see the other people or speak, but you would be able to put a comment in, and we will send around some of the information distilled into some talking points from these presentations that you may want to comment on, and we'll follow up with you about that. I'm going to share the link to sign up in the chat. We also want to take our movement to the Public Service Commission directly at their September meeting on Thursday, the 19th. I have a sign up to join us if you can come to Albany, show up at Building 3 on the morning of the 19th, and we'll not exactly sure what we're going to do. We're probably going to have a press conference and attend that meeting. And just to stay in touch with us, we have a listserv that I'm going to put the link to sign up for that, which is going to send out information every couple of weeks.